British trade unionists in the north on a fact-finding mission has been given the grand tour.
A summer's evening in a family home. A young couple chat after putting their children to bed.
This town and surrounding area usually has a disarming atmosphere of rustic normality.
What was that?
Yet the market square and the adjoining streets are constantly patrolled by the British Army.
I can remember waking up to, broken glass and hearing a lot of noise. I remember coming up the short hallway, seeing the window broken and seeing my father lie on the doorstep, partially in and partially out, in a pool of blood. I remember sitting here on the doorstep with him for over 2 hours.
His daughter, 4 years of age, covered with blood and crying. The pathos of that. The little girl with her father. She alive on the doorstep and he dead. Why?
The gun that killed him was one of hundreds stolen from British Army bases in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. These guns ended up in the hands of loyalist paramilitaries and those who were working with them.
We were a group of police officers who linked up with UDR, UVF, UDA. Our role was to carry out attacks against nationalist and Republican community. These were bomb, shooting attacks. If ordinary Catholics were shot, nobody was too worried about it.
The families of hundreds of victims are taking legal cases against the British government, convinced there's been widespread collusion between loyalists and the British security forces. They still want answers about why so many died in what's known as the Dirty War.
If you can establish the truth, you're not rewriting history, you're telling history.
I don't believe any Irish government have had the balls to go and ask the British government for the documents to find out what was going on and if there was collusion.
We don't have the closure yet that we're seeking. We will keep going in the name of my father and his legacy.
I am certain that not only Sammy Duddy were working for the security forces.
Collusion, that could mean that you were operating in a military fashion with paramilitaries, cover up for them, give information to them, withhold information if you knew what they were doing. All that obviously would be collusion.
British governments have always denied collusion played a significant part in the conflict.
It wasn't systemic, because systemic means it was approved throughout the system. And I'm perfectly certain it wasn't.
I would have thought it was systemic. We had strong suspicions that there was collusion. We would raise it, the British would deny it. That was it.
The early years of the conflict were the bloodiest. In 1972, almost 500 died.
This was Belfast's worst day of violence since the Troubles started in 1969, and inevitably it's provoked a strong and outspoken response from the loyalist section of the population. It demanded, amongst other things, that the British government now direct the security forces to beat the bombers and the gunmen into the ground.
This is when this province teetered on the edge of civil war. You had 30,000 troops on the ground. You had almost a terrorist action every 40 minutes or so in that period. Undoubtedly, we were overwhelmed. We were combating what you would call almost an explosion of activity on the streets.
Quick! March!
Men with muscle were taking to the streets. This was the Loyalist Ulster Defence Association.
The UDA, with their masks, their kind of cocky ex-army kind of fatigues, sort of strutting around the streets of Belfast. The guns aren't on public display, but there is a hint that guns are there. They have been used in assassinations.
It was an impressive show of strength by the UDA, but that's why they staged the march. The UDA say it was to show that they're a well-drilled and disciplined paramilitary force. Today, they say, is a warning to both Mr. Whitelaw and to the IRA.
The UDA's message to the British government was blunt. You deal with the IRA, or we will.
Does that mean that you're prepared to resort to violence to settle it?
If it was necessary, yes.
The British Army commander was General Harry Tuzo. According to a declassified government memo, Tuzo decided to turn a blind eye to UDA arms, provided they were confined to Protestant areas.
Tuzo's idea is that in hard loyalist areas, if you like, the UDA will be given a role as an auxiliary to the security forces. And that's made fairly clear.
And here the UDA's own police were on view.
Relations were a wee bit strained with the army the other night there. As you know, everything's back to normality again. Relations are A1 as far as we're concerned tonight with the army. If anybody causes any bother, you know where to take them to.
I think from the beginning, from Tuzo's memo in 1972, you have a recognition that we can use these people as kind of allies, as a kind of a fifth column in our campaign against the IRA.
At the time, one British Army officer saw this alliance more as cooperation than collusion.
All elements of the security forces felt they were fighting the same enemy. If the paramilitaries in the Protestant community want to protect their own communities and are being, I suppose the word is vigilantes, we will turn a blind eye to that. And I don't think they had any alternative.
The two youths in the car, one has long blonde hair, and one of them is armed.
One Irish diplomat had serious concerns about the Ulster Defence Regiment, or UDR, a locally recruited and mainly Protestant part of the British Army.
The first accusation that was conveyed to me was UDR people were lending their equipment to UVF, UDA people.
Meaning weapons?
Meaning weapons, yes. And possibly also their expertise, such as it was, which would include intelligence. Local intelligence. And
about IRA suspects and the like.
Yes, people whom they deemed to be IRA suspects.
As a former British police commander, Dave Cox led a team of detectives to review many Troubles-related murders.
There were many examples of involvement by security forces in the commission of terrorist offences, the provision or loss of weapons to loyalist paramilitaries was at an alarming rate. There was a serious problem. There's a lot of people who got in the UDR for reasons other than it was set up for.
Sean Donlan says he often raised his concerns at the highest level with British officials.
They would say, look, we're fighting a battle. We're not going to fight it on two fronts. We're dealing with the provisional IRA. You can't expect us at the same time to be, in a sense, full frontal with the loyalist paramilitaries. So if certain things are happening on the loyalist paramilitary side, so be it. And from early days, our point, Dublin to London, was this, if you don't deal with this little seed will grow. That's exactly what happened.
I'd met Betty in Birkenhead, Liverpool, many years before. I came home, and if he didn't bump into each other again a couple of years later, and the attraction from previous had been still there, and we got married and settled down in Katy.
With 3 young children, the MacDonalds bought a pub in Keady, County Armagh, and lived above it.
Well, it was a family home with a business attached. Very friendly people, and it was a good going town. It was very busy, and Katy was a mixed area. No problem. My trade was mixed. Our trade was mixed. There was no troubles that time. What happened came out of the blue. 1976, it was a lovely year. The sun was very, very warm.
Sunday, August the 16th was a busy evening for Malachy and Betty MacDonald. 2 of their children were staying with relatives, a third was in bed. Maria McShane went to the bar with a friend that night. She was 18, about to get married and pregnant.
We crossed the roads and there was these 2 strangers sitting in a car, a metallic blue car. The man that was driving, he looked at us and started to laugh. And I was fuming, and I said to my friend, "What are they laughing at?" So we went on into the bar, and never been in it before. There was seats there, and the men were all sitting, and one man was saying, "Oh, well, we've got our day at your wedding, Maria." And I was saying, "You're right, not belong."
Remember saying to Betty, I have to go up the street to the previous owner. I wanted to borrow his trailer. And I had just gone out to the door, and I always remember the 2 cars were parked there. I had to put my feet like that to get through them. And I was just on the other side of the car whenever I heard this awful noise. And I turned around and all I saw was just like a black hole. It got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
And all I could see was this hole in the wall. And I just sat and I looked and I thought, Jesus, what has happened? And I didn't even realise that it was a bomb.
The house was gone. What used to be our living room, our home, was gone. When I burned down the 3 steps into the bottom bar, we just saw Betty lying on top of a pile of rubble, dead, with her young son crying over, I think trying to waken her up, or, what a child does,
There was bolts, acid, you name it, they had it in it. I had metal in my arms, my legs. This eye was completely shattered. But all I kept saying was, "Get me a doctor quick, I'm pregnant. I'm losing my baby."
Maria McShane was rushed to hospital. She lost an eye, but despite her injuries, she was able to give the police a description of the 2 men in the car. Her baby survived. Gavin was born 5 months later. A 22-year-old man also died in the bomb. Malachy MacDonald lost his wife, his home and his business, and was left to raise 3 young children on his own.
I just hid it away. I pretended it didn't happen. I knew it happened. I pretended it didn't happen. But I had no house. I had children stayed in different places for a while. I had even borrowed clothes to go to Betty's funeral.
They hadn't a toy. They had to change everything. Everything had to be changed. There was nothing there. They had nothing to go home.
Despite a police investigation, no one was charged for the step-in bomb, which was claimed by a loyalist paramilitary group, the Ulster Volunteer Force. For the first time, one of those involved in the plot has agreed to speak on television. But John Weir was not a paramilitary, he was a serving police sergeant. He has given evidence to an Irish government inquiry and to a special British unit who investigated dozens of killings. Both found Weir credible. He says the original plan was to bomb a bar in Clontibret in County Monaghan 24 hours earlier.
It was to be done that night when there'd be a crowd in it. There was even a suggestion put a second one in the town, and when the crowd would gather, hit a crowd of people again, even after the bomb was done.
The bomb in a stolen car was made here at this farmhouse at Glenanne in South Armagh, then owned by James Mitchell, also a serving police officer.
This house was frequented regularly by Army intelligence. Army patrols out on ground would have called for a cup of tea. UDR boys lived in the area, everybody were friends. I called when I was a sergeant in the area, I called many a time myself with my fellow officers.
The night before the Keady bomb, John Weir went ahead to Clontibret, the original target, to check that the coast was clear, but he ran into a Garda checkpoint. When he returned to the farm to warn Mitchell and the gang, they already knew that the Gardaí had been alerted to the plot. According to Weir, Mitchell had also been tipped off that the house was being watched by undercover British soldiers.
There was so much stuff lying about it, guns, explosives. He didn't even know where half of it was.
John Weir says he left the farm that evening. By next morning, the British Army's surveillance had been inexplicably withdrawn. The Glenanne gang decided to bomb Keady instead.
This is where it starts to get very strange, because obviously you don't just do surveillance on a farm without doing background on who the farm is. And of course, at that time, James Mitchell was a serving part-time reserve, RUC. So that would have been apparent.
Days earlier, the car used in the bomb had been hijacked in Belfast. The owner, a serving policeman, reported it immediately and identified the hijackers as loyalist paramilitaries. But the officer was never asked to attend an ID parade of suspects, and precise, detailed intelligence warning of an attack was never properly exploited.
Then you know there's a bomb going to be put somewhere. It just seems amazing that the whole thing is just not stopped.
What would you have expected to happen?
Well, again, you would have expected that there would have been arrests and searches, chances for forensic evidence, perhaps the bomb recovered, the stolen car recovered. You would expect that sort of response.
By this time, the Glenanne gang had been operating for at least 3 years and are now strongly suspected of carrying out the worst atrocity of the Troubles, the Dublin Monaghan bombs, in which 33 people died. Aidan Shields' mother was one. She'd driven into Dublin to collect her husband.
We believe she was just standing outside the shop when the blast happened. He would have passed my mother by on the street moments after the explosion, and he didn't find out till afterwards, obviously, that she was in there to collect him. So we came back home, and it must have been 10:30, 11 o'clock maybe at this stage. So somebody eventually mentioned City Morgue, so that's where we went, and fortunately that's where we found her. There were bodies everywhere. It was, I don't like to use the word, but it was like a slaughterhouse. Unbelievable. I had to go home and tell my father, and he died 22 months later, I believe, from a broken heart.
An Irish government inquiry into the Dublin Monaghan bombings concluded,
"It is likely that the farm at Glenanne played a significant part in the attacks."
John Weir says that although he wasn't there when the Dublin Monaghan bombings were planned, the gang talked openly about it.
Everybody knows who did Dublin Monaghan. My goodness, it's not exactly a secret. The men who were doing the attacks, a lot of it was retaliation. But there were bigger men behind the scenes. Security services, army intelligence, special branch, who had their own motives behind it.
The gang were involved in multiple atrocities like the Miami Showband massacre and the bombing of Donnelly's Bar in Silverbridge and Hayden's Bar in Pomeroy. And there were ballistic links between many of the weapons used in the murders. Dennis Mullen was one of the victims. His daughter often relives the trauma of that night.
I can still see the lights, the brightness, the coldness, the smell. I can remember sitting here and seeing the ambulance arrive. I remember Seamus Mullen arriving.
A member of the security forces was convicted of Dennis Mullen's murder. His daughter believes he was targeted because he was active in the SDLP and successful in his health service job.
There had to be someone that was instructing them how to kill. And I want to know who that was. I want accountability from them.
Dennis was a good friend of mine, great person, very outgoing, just a real gentleman. So how these people defended the kingdom was killing people like Dennis Mullen and many, many others.
Taoiseach Jack Lynch and his successor Liam Cosgrave raised concerns about collusion directly with the British Prime Minister.
Both of them raised the possibility of collusion with Ted Heath, who was then the British Prime Minister. Subsequently got assurances that no, this was not the case. But we were very sceptical about these assurances, not least because any of our detailed consultations with the British in relation to other incidents had led us to distrust any information that originated with security forces.
Declassified documents now show the British government was well aware of collusion.
We had access to papers from government at the time. Huge concerns about the number of UDR weapons being stolen, in inverted commas, or going missing and ended up in the hands of loyalist paramilitaries.
The gun used to kill Dennis Mullen was also used months later in another atrocity at Whitecross in South Armagh. On the 4th of January 1976, three brothers, John Bryan and Anthony Reeve, were sitting by the fire watching television when Anthony noticed the door opening.
Me and the two brothers were sitting watching television, and a man came in through the door with a gun and a mask, and I just started to shoot. I didn't know what was going on. And me and my brother Brian tried to get into the room, but he was shot as he was going through the door. I went in under one of the beds in the room. And while I was under there, the gunman, he kept shooting at me. I lay still there. He must have taken me for being dead. And what did you do after the gunman had gone? I crawled out from under the bed and I seen my blood. My legs were just a mass of blood. I still got up and I made my way up to the neighbour's house. I sort of walked, crawled along the road and hiding under the ditches, you know, and raised the alarm up there. They phoned the police and ambulance.
John Martin, Lord of Mercy, he was just lying on the floor and he was riddled in bullets, he was a mass of blood and bullets, it was terrible altogether. Brian, Lord of Mercy, had a single shot in the back. It must have went to his heart, you know. And Anthony had been shot maybe about 20 to 24 times, and he was the only one that could testify.
10 days after this interview, Anthony also died. A recent inquiry indicates that the Reeve brothers were murdered by a gang which included security force members. The Reeves and numerous other families believe their loved ones' murders have never been properly investigated. They want the courts to hold the British state to account.
All the families have suffered. There was none of us involved in it. We were all innocent families, and I hope that now that we will get a chance and that the British will have to accept that they were involved in collusion with these paramilitaries and with their own security forces.
John Weir says a deliberate doomsday strategy was behind some of the attacks on the innocent.
And what was the thinking behind it? What was the rationale?
There would have been a thinking, if it were pushed far enough, it would cause an all-out civil war. If there was a civil war, everybody was going to have to take a stand for their own side. And I think there were men who were willing to do that, take their chance. At the end of the day, we would have had the UDR behind us, we had the guns.
So the
we would have big confidence that it was in our favour, and if it came to the crunch, we could crush the other side.
Sergeant Weir and the rest of the gang continued to terrorise Catholics for another 3 years before they were rounded up. At the time, Ray White was a special branch detective in Mid-Ulster.
RUC, as it then was, seemed to have taken quite a long time in neutralising the Glenanne gang. I mean, why was that?
Undeniable, John, in that sense. This was at the very beginning, as it were, of the 1970s. I think you're talking about 10 police officers there, I think, that were identified in total in relation to that. Now, there was UDR personnel and things of that nature associated with it. I can't go into the specifics of that investigation because I wasn't party to the investigation itself. I take the point that you're making. And I take the point that the response was slow in that respect.
So slow that it only began after one of the gang, Billy McCahey, ended up on a psychiatric ward and began talking. Among those he implicated was Sergeant Weir. Both got life for the murder of a Catholic chemist. Mulcahy and 3 other officers had also launched a gun and bomb attack on an isolated bar in the Armagh countryside.
On the evening in question, a car pulls up outside the pub, but just at that moment, a customer, Mick McGrath, is leaving the pub. The car had stopped and a gunman wearing a balaclava had got out. And without any conversation or anything, just shot him down in the street. Mick was hit in the stomach area and fell to the ground. The gunman went over to the pub and fired a volley of shots through the window. A bomb was placed against the door, 10 pounds of commercial explosive in a tin packed with nails and bolts.
By good fortune, the bomb failed to explode. Mick McGrath, although seriously injured, survived.
And it transpired that the attack had been planned at Mitchell's farm in Glenanne, that everybody involved in it had been serving police officers, and that 3 of the officers had gone off duty into Newry to steal the car. This had been used as the attack vehicle and escaped in a police vehicle which had picked them up from the burning car.
Using police radios?
There had been access to police radios to monitor security force response.
Where we could prosecute, we prosecuted. Where we couldn't prosecute, we dismissed those people. We got them out of our service, or we charged them with disciplinary issues. And as I say, and if we didn't have either evidence for disciplinary matters or whatever, we neutralised those people as best we could.
The gunman who tried to kill Mick McGrath was Constable Mulcahy. Yet the prosecution dropped charges of attempted murder against him and his co-accused after he claimed he had intended only to wound McGrath, not to actually kill him.
If that is the case, which certainly we never believed, he missed because he shot him in the body.
In the stomach?
In the stomach. And to shoot somebody with a submachine gun in the body is so reckless it does amount to attempted murder.
Mulcahy and his fellow officers got just 1 and 2 year sentences, all suspended.
I think if it happened today, people getting sentenced to 20, 25 years. I can't see any mitigation in this at all.
The trial judge, Lord Chief Justice Lowry, did not regard the police officers as terrorists.
I must remember that whatever sentence is just, it would follow that it would be imposed on a different and lower scale from that appropriate to terrorists.
What's your view of that?
Amazing. Mind-boggling. It destroyed any prospect of confidence in the police amongst the Catholic or nationalist community. The people would just throw their hands up in horror and say, well, how do you answer that?
As for the British government, they refused to hand over thousands of documents to an Irish government inquiry investigating the activities of the Glenanne gang. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected British Prime Minister.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister.
Shortly before entering Downing Street, Mrs Thatcher lost her most trusted confidant, Erin Neave, at the hands of a Republican splinter group.
And just one more thing. Some devils got him. And they must never, never, never be allowed to triumph. They must never prevail.
Collusion wasn't happening in a vacuum. Soon after Mrs Thatcher came to power, the IRA were armed by Libya's Colonel Gaddafi. So vast was their arsenal, the IRA thought they could win. Whilst politicians spoke of the need for a political solution, we now know the Thatcher government had other ideas. According to the British Army's own account of its 38-year campaign in Northern Ireland, codenamed Operation Banner, the British government's main military objective in the 1980s was the destruction of the IRA, rather than resolving the conflict.
She steeled herself. She had a mission. She had to deal with it, and deal with it she did. Now, it doesn't matter whether it was the Falklands or whether it was the IRA.
Mrs. Thatcher maintained the IRA would be fought within the rule of law. In practice, the response to the IRA sometimes employed the tactics of war. In the late 1980s, the IRA launched a new offensive. This was all that was left of a bus carrying soldiers to a nearby base. 8 died, many were maimed for life. Ken McGuinness, who'd been a major in the Ulster Defence Regiment, visited the scene.
I lifted the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning and phoned Downing Street. Within about 40 minutes, my phone rang, and who was it? The Prime Minister herself, at 10 to 3 in the morning, saying to me, "Oh yes, Kenneth, come over."
She asked you who you thought may have been responsible, is that right? Was that meeting, or was it a separate meeting?
That was at that meeting, and I think it would have been more that in conversation with her about the incident, I would have mentioned those who had been involved.
The people whose names you gave to Margaret Thatcher, they ended up dead, is that right?
Well, yes, that is true.
9 days after this conversation, 3 IRA men were ambushed and killed by the SAS in the same area as the bus attack.
Of course I felt, thank God, that's the end of those 3 fellas. They'll not be killing any more of my soldiers.
And that's war.
And that's war.
You were operating secretly, often closer to the rules of war.
How can you call it war in your own country? It would have been a civil war, and you can't have that. This was the dilemma. This was the unique aspect of the whole of the Troubles, that it was happening within the United Kingdom, and that gave you all sorts of problems and difficulties. But the option of saying, "Okay, gloves off, it's war," was not an option.
Politicians like Seamus Mallon continued to voice concerns about collusion, and particularly about the murderous activities of the UDA, which, by the late 1980s, was, to his astonishment, still a legal organisation.
The very fact that they allowed a murder gang to continue for that length of time gives credence to the view that they were working with them, and they wanted to keep them in existence legally for as long as they possibly could. That seems to be the only reason.
In August 1989, the UDA shot dead a Catholic man in County Down, Lachlan McGinn. Nationalist politicians and the Irish government alleged the security forces had colluded with the UDA in targeting him. Shankill UDA leader Tommy Little was anxious to prove they had got the right man. He leaked the McGinn intelligence to a journalist. It's long been suspected that Little, who died in 1995, had links to the IUC Special Branch. He left behind a tape obtained by RTE in which he attempts to justify the murder of Lachlan McGinn.
It has to be stressed here. And this come about because people knew that McGinn was an IRA man, and they wanted it proved. They were fed up with being accused of shooting innocent Catholics.
It's generally accepted that in the past 20 years, RUC intelligence information has often found its way into the hands of loyalist paramilitaries. Once again, but now more than ever, that very fact threatens the credibility of the RUC and the British Army, including, of course, the UDR itself.
The Irish government demanded an inquiry into collusion. The RUC had a new chief constable. Hugh Annesley had no choice but to call in an outside inquiry.
Morning, gentlemen.
John Stevens was then Deputy Chief Constable of Cambridge.
You say how impartial or how thorough the investigation will be? Be totally impartial, I can assure you.
What was intended as a short inquiry spanned more than a decade.
The scale of the leaks and the amount of documentation was considerable. There was a widespread problem with leaks. I mean, everyone accepted that, from MI5 to, I think, the RUC themselves.
Evidence indicates that some 100 policemen in Greater Belfast alone were in contact with Loyalist paramilitaries. Stevens then discovered that the British Army was running its own agent at the top of the UDA. His name was Brian Nelson. Shankill-born Nelson was discharged from the British Army for being mentally unstable. He was later jailed for the abduction and torture of a blind Catholic man, Gerald Higgins. After his release, he was re-employed by the British Army, this time as their agent within the UDA.
We were given a kind of an updating by the Army. It was a colonel, and he told everyone on the inquiry, there were, I think, 28, 29 of us in the room, that the Army categorically didn't run agents, which was obviously not true.
That was a lie.
It was a lie.
And he knew that.
He must have.
What do you think of that?
Not much, as it happens.
Meanwhile, on the streets, the UDA openly taunted Stevens by pasting leaked security force intelligence documents about IRA suspects on walls.
What action was taken by the security forces to stop these leaks?
I think there was very little. I think the feeling was with montages and some of the intelligence that it actually wasn't of a higher grade to take much attention to. But of course it was. It identified people who were thought to be, and maybe were, terrorists in terms of the IRA.
The secret unit inside the British Army which recruited Nelson was known as the Force Research Unit, or FRU. They recruited agents within both Loyalist and Republican groups. The FRU encouraged Nelson to work his way up the UDA to become its head of intelligence gathering. He was paid nearly £50,000. To help him identify IRA targets, the FRU set him up as a taxi driver. This gave Nelson cover to enter hardline Republican areas. He relished this cloak and dagger world, as he later wrote in a private journal. Nelson recorded the addresses, the cars, and the movements of those to be shot by the UDA. These details came from several hundred leaked security force and intelligence reports. Back at Army headquarters, his handlers weeded out the old files and returned only those of IRA suspects who were still active. Everything was copied, so the Army had a record of who might be shot. The updated files were now returned to Nelson for what the FRU described as action.
The case study of Nelson is prima facie evidence that there were people within the security, the state, in that case the military, operating way outside any common sense or guidelines, almost as if it was a maverick unit.
Sometimes Nelson's handlers actively assisted his targeting. They confirmed car registration numbers, for example. The FRU records, later discovered by Stevens, claimed that Nelson's targeting had become more professional, but that was rarely so. Nelson had sent gunmen to the home of Terry McDade. It was a case of mistaken identity. He had just sat down with his wife to watch the news after putting their young daughters to bed when two gunmen crashed through the front door and began shooting.
We got up to go and see what had happened. I did go to the top of the stairs, but it was, you know, squealing, keep the children up there, don't let them come down, keep them up. And we were up there for, you know, a wee while.
Yeah, by that stage, the neighbours from the street had been able to come into the house to tell us to stay up the stairs because we could hear them screaming. I just remember holding my granny's hand going down the stairs, but we were told not to look. Don't look.
You're an 8-year-old child, you don't look, you're going to look. So I looked in and seen my daddy lying there, you know, partly on the floor and on the settee, with my mummy standing over him at that stage.
Handlers tried to actually convince him that McDade actually was a person who was working for the IRA and was an IRA operative.
Terry McDade had nothing to do with the IRA?
No.
The FRU also approved the mass dissemination of Nelson's targeting files, not just to the UDA, but to all Loyalist paramilitaries.
It was simply unlawful, it was out of control. One could argue the plot had been lost. Any professional police officer that read that would have been staggered by the behaviour. Not only the behaviour, the access to official product that individual had.
2 years later, the same UDA group assassinated Belfast lawyer Pat Finucane.
There are some times, and this happens in many scenarios in the world, where shining a light on just one case can shine a light on how a system works. The Finucane case very much is that case.
The lawyer at the heart of many high-profile and controversial cases was also a family man.
Pat really enjoyed the kids. He was a great one for teasing and banter, bit of winding you up. The other serious side in the house was when the phone rang, you had to learn how to take a message on the jotter. Even John, you were, P2, but you were still able to write down a message.
Yeah, well, you made the mistake once, and then you were convinced not to make it again, yeah, so you knew how to take messages.
Yeah.
Do you remember you bought him an answering machine, and he fought with it for about a day and then threw it aside and decided, you know,
we were doing a better job.
We were doing a better job, so the family secretariat was re-employed.
But your dad, when he was working, he always just did those little extra things.
He's a people person.
He
liked people, and he enjoyed people's company, and I think he valued people.
Because Pat Finucane represented clients in a number of prominent IRA cases, he became the target of a whispering campaign by police to his clients when they were being interrogated.
Became death threats, and the death threats started sometime 1988.
Your solicitor won't be around.
Your solicitor won't be around. Your solicitor is somebody who's going to be killed, and it got to the stage where it was pretty frequent.
The British Army can't break into Pat Finucane's house and shoot him directly themselves, or the RUC can't do that. But if a proxy organisation does that gives you plausible deniability, and he is seen as part of your enemy, then it makes complete sense.
Within days of being prompted by police to kill Pat Finucane, the UDA began to plot his assassination. British intelligence soon heard about this. Word reached agents in the Special Branch, the FRU, and MI5. The UDA leader, Tommy Little, has said that when he discussed the assassination plot with a senior Special Branch officer, the detective signalled his approval. An informant also warned MI5 that a lawyer described as the shoot-to-kill solicitor in Armagh would be shot. MI5 now claim they didn't know this threat referred to Finucane.
What's your response to that?
I think that's very strange. Pat had a very high profile in that case. In fact, it was televised going into the court to challenge decisions in relation to that case. So the public would have known that he was the only solicitor in that case.
For the third time, Pat Finucane was not warned he was being targeted. MI5's claim not to have known the latest threat referred to Finucane is hard to reconcile. He'd also been the target of an MI5 propaganda campaign. They'd used an agent in the UDA to profile him as an IRA solicitor in a loyalist magazine.
It is a fundamental principle that a solicitor cannot be equated with the views of his client. If it's their idea and they were directing it, and they were using loyalists to conduct it, then it doesn't make sense that they would actually do something, to stop it. So I think it speaks for itself.
Before Finucane was shot, the FRU agent Brian Nelson gave this photograph of him to the hit team. The RUC High Command, meanwhile, had briefed a Home Office minister that Finucane was one of several lawyers, in their words, effectively in the pockets of terrorists, knowing the minister would make this public.
There are in Northern Ireland a number of solicitors who are unduly sympathetic to the cause of the IRA. I state it on the basis of guidance that I've been given by people who are dealing in these matters.
I told him in fairly robust terms what I thought he had done. I told him that I thought that he signed the death warrants for some people. Of course, he walked away. That's the way these fellas do.
5 days before Finucane was shot, the Special Branch were told by one of their informers that the UDA had a hit planned on a top IRA man. The informer was Billy Stobie. He was told to provide a 9mm pistol a day or two before the hit was planned. Stobie told his handlers this, yet the branch did nothing. At 7:25 on Sunday the 12th of February, Patrick Finucane, his wife, and 3 children were having dinner at home in North Belfast when gunmen burst in.
It was absolutely horrendous, and because we investigated it, we got to know exactly what happened and saw the pictures and the like. They burst into Patrick Finucane's house, into his kitchen, and murdered him in front of his wife and his family. And the exact circumstances are, they put a number of shots into his head, which made it not very recognisable. Horrific incident.
Whenever your dad died, I decided that because they had killed him and devastated our lives, they weren't going to break the family. And I don't think they have.
Nearly a year after Pat Finucane's murder, the net began to close on Brian Nelson. His British Army handlers had other ideas.
What are the instructions that the FRU give Nelson should he be arrested by you or questioned?
Well, just to say nothing. I mean, that's exactly what he was told. And he'd had actually anti-interrogation techniques taught to him by FRU.
The pressure on Nelson and the FRU soon reached crisis point. Stevens was about to arrest the agent. 24 hours later, in panic, Nelson fled to England. That night, Stevens' office, in one of the most secure police bases in Northern Ireland, went up in flames.
When we went over to Northern Ireland, we met up with the Assistant Chief Constable Crime, and we were categorically warned that we would have our headquarters burnt down. That was on day 2.
He specifically said that?
He specifically said burnt down. As a result of that, we never left all our documentation in Northern Ireland. To be honest, I never ever thought it would ever take place. I mean, the allegation was that one of our staff had had a cigarette and thrown it into the waste paper basket.
But she had, hadn't she?
She had not. She hadn't thrown a cigarette in any shape or form. It's unexplained. It is unexplained who did it, but it's not unexplained in terms of what it was.
Which was deliberate in your view?
Absolutely. The coincidences were too much, and also other aspects of it as well.
And the alarms didn't work?
And the alarms didn't work.
The Fru told Nelson to return to Belfast, where they said they'd look after him. He was promptly arrested by the Stevens team. While Nelson was on remand, he wrote a journal detailing his activities as an agent of the British state, which ran to nearly 100 pages. As he awaited trial, the deep roots of collusion were being pulled to the surface, a vista the British had never expected to emerge. It wasn't just British military intelligence who'd colluded with the UDA through their agent Brian Nelson. Tommy Little, who was Nelson's UDA boss, also had close links with RUC's Special Branch. As this tape reveals, it's a story of money and influence.
He opened a suitcase. This is £50,000. This is yours after a year. If anything happens to you, we make sure such and such is looked after. Your wife's looked after. Other people will be looked after. Blah blah blah. And I says no, and left him.
In January 1990, the Stevens team arrested members of the UDA, among them the Shankill UDA boss, Tommy Little. While in jail, Little learned the UDA suspected he was an informer and planned to kill him. As insurance, he made a secret tape.
Since my arrest, a campaign of innuendo and all the dirty tricks possible have been waged against me. I've been accused of working for CIA, Mossad, KGB, MI5, MI6. I utterly deny and refute any such allegation.
Little also revealed he had close links with a senior RUC Special Branch officer who told him of a loyalist working for the IRA, thereby putting the man's life in great danger.
It says that he could reveal the names of people collaborating with the IRA, with the security forces, if I would help them. I agreed to set up an operation in which this person would be picked up and made to confess.
The collaborator was taken to a house in South Belfast for interrogation. His loyalist captors first posed not as the UDA, but as the IRA. When they searched him and found a piece of paper with his IRA contact's phone number, the mood changed.
How's the fucking name? Score the bar, people not score the bus.
He came within an inch of his life. The Special Branch officer's tip-off could have led to his murder. This time, however, his life was spared. Little's Special Branch contact was known to him as Mr. Scott.
It was videoed, it was taped, and everybody was chuffed at the way it turned out, and the credit came by the organisation. They were also aware of the part played by Mr. Scott.
Little said the branchman continued to try to recruit him by promising to unmask other UDA informers and warning him about assassination plots.
He again offered me sums of money. He phoned me a number of times, even into the summer of '89. I totally refused to see him. There was anything more to do with him. The tactic he used is threats to your life.
In 2012, the British Prime Minister David Cameron published a review he'd ordered into the murder of the Belfast solicitor Pat Finucane. It was conducted by the former UN Chief War Crimes Prosecutor, Sir Desmond de Silva. Although de Silva did not have access to the Little tape, he did refer to the incident.
He described that particular incident as inexcusable. On the face of it, I would concur with that. It's certainly a cause of serious concern to me, and are referring back to the police ombudsman issues of potential police misconduct.
How was it that collusion continued years after it had been exposed in the early 70s? One reason was because agents were run without proper rules. The security forces say these agents did save many lives, but handling them was also double-edged.
Once you talk about a police agent, you're talking about an individual who's deeply within a paramilitary group. He has to act as a, shall we say, first-class paramilitary.
That's the dilemma, and the dilemma for the first time happened to us in Northern Ireland because it was within the United Kingdom. This had happened in Cyprus or Aden or Kenya or Malaya, all of the places where we operated for years after the war. It wouldn't have arisen.
Why not?
Because there was not the same
scrutiny,
sensitivity about breaking a foreign law.
And no media to account to.
That's part of it. I'm not justifying this. I'm trying to explain how different the thinking was in those days.
In the late 80s, the head of the branch in Belfast, Ray White, raised the dilemma over agent handling with Mrs. Thatcher.
I just took the opportunity, as it were, almost off the cuff to say, well, you know, Prime Minister, I would welcome, as it were, detailed guidance and regulation in relation to what we're doing. We were operating in a very grey area in which there was no case law of very little nature. And in essence, we were, as a police service, making up guidance for ourselves as to how we should morally, and if you want to look at it that way, professionally behave ourselves and live within the law.
Other senior police officers and MI5 were asking ministers the same question, to no avail.
I think somehow the establishment, by which I mean the civil service and the security services and the authorities, thought it would be better if ministers didn't know the fine detail of these things.
Why though?
Because they might be asked to account for them.
Ministers?
Yes. And if they didn't know, they could say they didn't know.
No minister is going to want to sign off on murder. No minister is going to want to sign off on a system that by its nature is illegal. It's the only level of plausible deniability that this was a matter of state practice and policy.
Senior officials and senior ministers did not give us the support or the guidance that that I felt we were entitled to.
The non-response, as it were, by ministers and officials to your request for a legal framework was carry on but don't get caught. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I think that just captured us in a nutshell.
Turning a blind eye is a useful political way of protecting oneself. So, no, I have no doubt that there was a strong sense of what was going on and a parallel desire not to know too much on the details.
The fact that no legal framework for agent handling existed is highlighted in De Silva's review. He concluded there'd been a willful and abject failure by successive governments. We asked many of the relevant British ministers at the time to answer the question on the record, why no framework? Only one was available for interview.
De Silva's phrase of willful negligence doesn't stand up.
You don't accept that?
No, I don't accept that because it wasn't willful. It was...
willful and abject.
Yes, well, okay, that's lawyers speak. He felt very strongly about it. He wasn't there at the time trying to do it.
The years rolled by and there was no framework. Why? Why not?
Because no one could think of one. No one could... There were two things. First, you wanted a framework. But secondly, you didn't want to damage your intelligence gathering capability. Now those two are in absolute conflict.
And I, personally as an Ulsterman, would be very concerned that Whitehall gets away with leaving the responsibility all at the hands of those who were risking their lives to protect me, to protect others, and often doing a very professional job in difficult circumstances.
We glimpsed the secret world of the informer without rules when Brian Nelson finally went to court.
The debacle that was the Nelson affair unfolds. You can see the whole manifestations of collusion at its worst, at a massive, devastating cost, because to keep that intelligence agenda alive, the lines became very blurred. People lost their lives.
In fact, the 5 conspiracy to murder charges Nelson admitted in court were just the tip of the iceberg. According to the De Silva Review, Nelson was involved in 14 murders and attempted murders and numerous conspiracies. Nelson was originally charged with the murder of Terence McDade, but just as the trial began, he unexpectedly pleaded guilty to the lesser charges of conspiracy to murder, which were accepted by the DPP. But it meant no trial.
We were expecting not guilty plea and went into court and heard him get up and plead guilty, which came as a big surprise to us.
The consequence of this, though, was that a considerable amount of what we now know was never revealed, wasn't it?
Oh yes, absolutely. It would have the trial would have been a lengthy one. It would have involved the handlers. It would have involved all sorts of people. It involved us giving evidence and other people giving evidence. It would have been a lengthy process.
All right. Good. RTE asked Sir Patrick Mayhew, the then Attorney General in London, if he'd been involved in this development. He replied, "I had no discussions about whether Nelson should or should not plead guilty." Even if he had no such discussions, a letter from the Northern Ireland Prosecution Service indicated that Sir Patrick Mayhew was consulted with and would have been kept informed. Tommy Little served 3 years in jail for handling security force documents on IRA suspects. Before he died, he said the UDA was riddled with informers.
There are also, it should be known, 22 known fingerprints and all documents relating to Stephen's inquiry. I know there was evidence, more overwhelming evidence against other people. They were charged, the charges were dropped.
Little named others who he believed were MI5 agents at the very top of the UDA.
I am certain that not only Sammy Duddy were working for the security forces, some branch, but other people.
Sammy Duddy, now dead, was a senior UDA man behind the MI5 propaganda campaign against Pat Finucane.
It is up to us to defend our country. We surrender!
After Tommy Little was deposed, a more militant leadership took over the UDA. There was a killing surge by loyalists. In 1991, in County Donegal, loyalists shot dead a Sinn Féin councillor, Eddie Fullerton. Fullerton is one of 19 killings now being investigated by the police ombudsman in Belfast. Among the 19 were 8 people gunned down in a County Derry bar on Halloween night. The inquiry will examine potential links between a loyalist paramilitary group and the security forces and their handling and direction of agents.
We have always believed that state agents were involved in the planning of the murder, in the handling of the loyalist paramilitaries that came over. The state is not meant to target its own citizens and have them murdered. And I think the state has to be made accountable for that role it played, because it was the really dirty aspect of this war.
In the early 1990s, both the Loyalists and the IRA took Northern Ireland to the very edge and then stepped back. Armed groups delivered ceasefires, clearing the way for politicians to negotiate the Good Friday Agreement.
The principle of consent is absolute
and is throughout the agreement. And the breakthrough is that that is now accepted by all, North and South.
But the past had not been forgotten. In 2003, 14 years after it began, the Stevens investigation concluded with a large file recommending the prosecution of Nelson's handlers and their commanding officer, Brigadier Gordon Kerr. A top London barrister felt much of the evidence met the test for prosecution.
As a matter of public record, that Kerr was interviewed over a period of days with full legal representation. That material was subject to a file to the Director of Public Prosecutions, who decided not to prosecute. And we, of course, as the investigators, must respect that decision. I think justice would have been better served by a public investigation, i.e. a trial.
In fact, the DPP decided no one in the security forces should be prosecuted. Kerr, meanwhile, was promoted to military attaché in Beijing.
I do not 1 second accept that there was any shame in this matter. If the Nelson episode taught us anything, it taught us that relationships between the Army and the RUC and the other agencies involved were strong enough to withstand any pressures that came about as a result of that investigation.
Nelson is thought to have served just 5 years in jail. He died in 2003, taking his secrets to the grave. We've been told he was awarded a medal by the British Army. The family of Pat Finucane were treated somewhat differently. Prime Minister Tony Blair had promised them a public inquiry in 2001. It never happened. When new Prime Minister David Cameron invited the family to Downing Street in 2011, they assumed they were finally getting one. Instead, they got an apology.
Mr. Speaker, the collusion demonstrated beyond any doubt by Sir Desmond, which included the involvement of state agencies in murder, is totally unacceptable. We do not defend our security forces or the many who have served in them with great distinction by trying to claim otherwise. Collusion should never, ever happen. So on behalf of the government and the whole country, let me say again to the Finucane family, I am deeply sorry. Just what they do to keep us safe.
What the government doesn't get, what I think British politicians don't get about Ireland is, at this point, you cannot expect anybody to take your word for it. You're just bankrupt on the credibility scale. And that was clearly a point lost on David Cameron.
A Prime Minister has admitted collusion in the killing of Pat Finucane. So there was collusion.
Who admitted that?
But David Cameron.
The boy Cameron.
Yep.
The boy Cameron, for God's sake. What did Cameron ever see beyond being at Eton and Oxford? What did he ever see? Don't quote Cameron to me in terms of
Prime Minister.
Well,
I mean, he was speaking on
the
behalf.
boy Cameron, as far as I'm concerned, he has no knowledge, he has no experience of what those of us went through. I'm 77 years of age, so I remember very well.
Are you saying Margaret Thatcher wouldn't have made that statement that Cameron made? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
The Finucane family are now fighting for a public inquiry through the courts.
A certain pattern has been followed in relation to many incidents in collusion and indeed otherwise. The initial British response at political level was denial. The second phase was usually cover up. And the last phase eventually was apology. But the apology, of course, never came in the lifetime of the administration which had been involved.
David Cameron hoped the Finucane Review would draw a line under the vexed issue of collusion. It hasn't.
This critical failure to act, particularly when there was informant exposure in high-ranking positions within the UVF, can only be described as collusion.
A decade after the Good Friday Agreement and a new police service, yet more evidence of collusion emerged, this time involving a UVF gang in North Belfast.
They just went on killing. They were like killing machines, you know, and they killed Catholics because they were the enemy until 1994. And in 1994, the IRA declared a ceasefire. And after 1994, it changed, and we realised that they were actually killing Protestants as well as Catholics.
When Nuala O'Lone attempted to speak to senior officers, she says she met a wall of silence.
We sought to interview 100 police officers, some of them very senior officers. 40 of them declined to speak to us, and we couldn't make them.
She says attempts were made to dissuade her from revealing the truth.
There was often quite a lot of, sometimes not very subtle pressure on me not to report. Because it would damage confidence in the newly established policing service, etc., etc. But had we not reported, we too would have colluded, because we would have known about all the wrongdoing that had occurred, and we would have allowed it to go under the carpet and remain there.
And who were these people? Were they senior government?
Some of them were, yes. I'm going no further than that.
8 years on from her report, there's been just one minor conviction, but now one of the UVF gang has turned supergrass. This is Gary Haggerty, an Ulster Volunteer Force leader and Special Branch agent. He faces hundreds of charges, including 5 murders. The state could also find itself in the dock if the case ever gets to court.
Was Gary Haggerty, another Brian Nelson. Already it suggests it will not be a good story for policing.
That may well be the case. It is a cause of concern for me, but nor do I want to do or say anything that is going to jeopardise either an ombudsman's investigation, our own investigation, prosecutorial decisions, or a pending trial.
Haggerty will not be the last skeleton to be unearthed from the Dirty War files, stored here at a high security location near Belfast. Here lie many of the secrets of the past.
I think if the vault was to be opened up, I know that there will be literally millions of documents. All of those inquiries, all of those reports are looking at the role of the police and other agencies like the British Army, perhaps.
The Chief Constable hints that when the vault is opened, the questions will be every bit as uncomfortable for Loyalists and the IRA.
I don't think we should be exempt from scrutiny and investigation as a police service, past or present, but I actually think other people have stories to tell and questions to answer.
I don't know if the full truth will ever come out, but I do think that you have to aspire to it and you have to aim to try and get the full truth out.
And Republicans are going to play their part?
We argued, we are the people who argued for the truth process. We're very much up for it. And I was asked personally, would I be up for it? And yes, I am.
It's been a long wait for the families of the Dublin Monaghan bomb victims. Every year, they come here to remember.
After 41 years, there's only one call left, and that's the call on both the Taoiseach, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and the new incoming British government to immediately release the documents and to immediately bring forward those who were responsible. I think the dogs in the street at this stage knows now whose fingerprints and hallmarks were over the bombs that was placed in the state. The evidence is there.
The recently re-elected Prime Minister David Cameron is now perfectly placed to provide answers to the questions that the families here present still have. words of reconciliation from his government during this decade of commemorations must be met with action.
It's not just future generations that need to know, it's our generation, past generation, people who have passed away without knowing the truth. It's up to us to find out the truth for them.
What we now know about the scale of collusion, is it greater than you had imagined when you were a minister?
Yes, it is. Obviously there was some going on and it kept surfacing here and there, but I didn't think it was anything like on the scale which we now know it was.
It was systemic because there was no proper management and control. My view was that if you were building your peace process on lies, on murders, on collusion, then you were building on very shifting sands, and ultimately the whole thing would come tumbling down.
This closure, I've heard this bandied at them. There's no such thing as closure. I don't want to see those people in jail. I don't want to see their mummy and daddy taken away on their thing. But at least if a fella say, you know, well, they done something bad, you know.
Do you want them to say sorry?
Yes. Simple. Apologise and sorry.
Do you have any regret or remorse for what you were involved in?
No, I wouldn't even think about it. It's not something that basically crosses my mind ever. To be honest about it, it doesn't really cross my mind.
There'll never be closure. I need to know those that authorised it, the facilitators.
I believe that to this day my mummy would still be here if it wasn't for the stress and the worry of it all and bringing me and Tracy up on our own. I'm just very proud of my mummy. It's just not till you get to an age where you realise what she went through.